Close your eyes for a moment and picture the most powerful warrior you can imagine. Give him centuries of accumulated experience in every form of combat ever devised, from the most intimate close-quarters brutality to the wide, orchestrated rhythm of a battlefield engagement. Wrap him in armor worth more than entire worlds, forged from materials so rare that even the greatest armorers of the Imperium guard their craft in secrecy across generations. Place in his hand a spear that is at once a masterpiece of the armorer's art, a bolt weapon of extraordinary refinement, and a blade crackling with barely contained energy capable of cutting a Chaos Space Marine cleanly in two. Now, stretch him to nearly 9 feet tall. Fill him with a physiology so far removed from ordinary human biology that the comparison barely holds meaning. Give him not just a soldier's mind, but the intellect of a scholar, a philosopher, a diplomat, and a strategist, all woven together into one breathtaking consciousness that has been refined over decades of conditioning. Now tell him his only purpose in existence is to guard one single man, and then tell him that single man is the emperor of mankind, the most powerful being the human species has ever produced, the divine sovereign of a million worlds, the light in the darkness of a galaxy that is constantly, endlessly, with infinite patience and infinite malice, trying to consume everything humanity has ever built or dreamed. That is a custodian. That is the Adeptus Custodes. And somehow, even with all of that, even with every conceivable advantage of body and mind and weapon and will, they still consider themselves to have failed. Yes, they live with that failure every waking moment. It has been 10,000 years and they have not stopped carrying it, not for a single day. Welcome back to Finn the Emperor. Settle in, get comfortable, because today we are going very deep into the lore of perhaps the most extraordinary warriors the Warhammer 40,000 universe has ever conceived. Not the most numerous warriors, not the most widely deployed, but arguably, and this argument is worth having at length, the most individually capable soldiers in all of human history, and the ones whose story cuts closest to the emotional core of what this setting is actually about. These are the 10,000. These are the Emperor's truest companions. These are the Adeptus Custodes, and their story stretches from before the fires of the Great Crusade were first lit. It's through the blood and horror of the Horus Heresy, through 10,000 years of silent vigil, and into the chaos and desperate hope of the Era Indomitus. It is a story of impossible devotion, a story of sacrifice measured not in years but in entire ages of history, a story of a guilt so profound it became the defining cultural fact of an entire organization, and a story of golden-armored warriors who stood at the edge of eternity and refused absolutely and without compromise to step back. So, let us begin at the beginning, or as close to it as the deliberately obscured histories of these people will allow us to get. Part 1. Before the Golden Throne. The age that made them Terra. Before it was the throne world of an empire spanning 1,000,000 suns, is before the gilded towers of the imperial palace rose to scrape the clouds and the eternal fires of the Astronomican's maintenance burned in its depths. It was something far more desperate and far more savage. The dark age of technology, that mythic era of human expansion and scientific achievement across the stars, had ended in catastrophe. The age of strife had descended on humanity like a vast shadow, severing the connections between human worlds, throwing civilizations back on their own resources against threats they had not faced since before the stars were colonized. Psychic emergences tore through populations. Alien entities pressed in from outside. Civil war and famine consumed what remained. On the very cradle world of the human species, that nightmarish period expressed itself most visibly in the form of the Unification Wars. A brutal, grinding, centuries-long process by which a single extraordinary individual set about reclaiming a fractured and broken Earth and forging it into the launching point for something more ambitious than anything humanity had attempted before. An empire, a real one, built not on the back of one generation's enthusiasm, but on a systematic, rational vision of what the human species could become, if guided by sufficient genius and sufficient will. That individual was, of course, the Emperor. And though the histories of this era are deliberately obscured, twisted by myth and selective memory, and the passage of more than 10,000 years of deliberate institutional amnesia, What is clear is that even in those earliest days, even before the dream of the Great Crusade had fully formed in his boundless and ancient mind, yes, the emperor understood something that most conquerors and empire builders throughout human history had failed to truly grasp. He needed something no ordinary army could provide. He could build soldiers in enormous numbers. The Thunder Warriors proved that. He could build armies capable of sweeping enemy forces before them, the way a fire sweeps through dry grass. But all of that would mean nothing if he himself could be killed, corrupted, or subverted. Everything else could be rebuilt from the correct foundations. But the emperor himself, the singular intellect at the center of all these plans, was irreplaceable. So he built the Custodians, or more precisely, he began the extraordinarily complex and long-running project of creating the Custodians, one by one, over years and then decades and then centuries. Each one a unique investment of time and resources and irreplaceable knowledge. The Legio Custodes, the Custodian Guard, the 10,000. They are described in the oldest accounts as the emperor's true firstborn, predating even the Thunder Warriors, who served as his primary fighting force during the earliest phases of unification. Their first recorded appearance in the historical sources comes during the fall of the techno-barbarian fortress at Nassau, early in the Unification Wars, when Golden Warriors were seen fighting at the Emperor's side against fortifications that had resisted everything else thrown at them. But the truth of when the Emperor first began this project, and how the very earliest Custodians were shaped, remains wrapped in layers of classification and deliberate myth. Yet these are people whose origin story the Imperium itself has chosen not to fully document, and the gaps are not accidental. What is known is this: the initial candidates were drawn from the offspring of Terran nobility, the great houses of a broken and fractured earth, still clinging to vestiges of wealth and bloodline, even through the chaos of the Age of Strife, were approached and in many cases simply compelled to offer their children for consideration. Honor was invoked, the future was promised, and in some cases, the emperor simply moved armies across continents to locate a specific child and bring that child to him, as the accounts describe happening with the man who would become the first and greatest of the Custodians. But even among noble bloodlines carefully selected for genetic potential, the acceptance rate was extraordinarily low. Only one candidate in many thousands would prove suitable for even the most preliminary stages of the creation process. And that number shrank still further as the process deepened, as each stage of augmentation and psychological conditioning applied its own brutal filter, and the subjects who could not bear the transformation were set aside. The emperor was not building a legion here. He was not running an industrial process designed to produce warriors in large numbers from an acceptable template. He was carving individual masterworks from the rarest of available materials, and he was perfectly willing to accept that this meant the numbers would always remain small. And crucially, yet the process through which the Custodians were made was fundamentally different from anything that would later be developed for the Space Marines. There was no standardized gene seed template propagated across thousands of candidates through a replicable industrial method. The Custodians were built directly from the Emperor's own genetic material, or at least from something derived from it at a profound level, though the full biological and alchemical truth of their creation remains one of the Imperium's most jealously guarded secrets. Some scholars have argued that the Custodians are to the Emperor what the Space Marines are to their Primarchs, reflections of their progenitor's own nature, shaped by the same essential genetic signature, even if the specific modifications are very different. And others argue that the relationship is something stranger and more complex. Either way, what the process produced was not a soldier in any conventional sense. It was something closer to what the myths of ancient human cultures might have called a champion of the gods. The Thunder Warriors, for all their ferocity, were blunt instruments, magnificent in their savagery, powerful beyond any normal human's reckoning, but unstable, prone to genetic degradation, inherently violent in ways that went beyond tactical necessity. They were hammers, and the Emperor used them like hammers, pointed at problems and swung until the problems stopped existing. But he built the Custodians to be something else entirely, to be his companions in the fullest sense, to be his protectors in every environment, to be, when the darkness demanded it, his most precise and devastating instruments of execution, but also to be the people he could actually talk to, whose minds could operate on a level that made genuine intellectual exchange with the Emperor possible. This distinction mattered enormously in shaping what the Custodians became. They were crafted as individuals, where the Space Marines would eventually be shaped through their training and indoctrination to function as part of a larger whole, to subsume individual impulse into the collective will of the chapter or the legion. Custodians were trained to be supremely capable alone. Every aspect of their augmentation, their psychological conditioning, their mimetic training was tailored to that specific individual's particular strengths and abilities. The result was a core of warriors who were, in many ways, genuinely unique, and who found their common identity not in shared heritage or collective doctrine, but in the singular shared purpose of protecting the Emperor of mankind. There is an ancient declaration attributed to the Emperor himself, spoken during the earliest days of the Unification Wars, when he formally bound the Custodians to their purpose. Its language is absolute in a way that tells you everything about what he intended this organization to be. These men are my bodyguards. Their lives are forfeit to the guarantee of my physical safety. Of their loyalty to me there shall be no question nor doubt. I, and I alone, shall have authority to stand in judgment over them. No other commander shall they have in battle, nor in service. No other commander. That line is the key to understanding everything the Custodians were and would become. Not the High Lords of Terra, not the greatest Primarchs, not even Rogel Dorn himself, whose role it would eventually become to organize the defense of the entire Imperial Palace, held formal authority over the Golden Warriors who walked within its halls. They answered to the Emperor and to no other power in the universe. And that independence was not arrogance. It was the only way to ensure that they could never be turned against him. The history of human politics is full of bodyguards who were subverted by the very political forces they were meant to protect their charges from. The Emperor was building a system where that kind of subversion was structurally impossible. The only way to compromise a Custodian was at the point of creation, which is why the creation process was so extraordinarily controlled, and why the Emperor himself was so deeply involved in it. Part 2. The making of a Custodian, what it costs. If you have spent any significant time in Space Marine lore, and given that you are watching this channel, the likelihood is very high, then you already know that the making of an Astartes is a brutal, painstaking, and genuinely remarkable process. 19 gene seed organs must be implanted into a human adolescent over a period of years. Many candidates die during the process, and those deaths are simply accepted as the cost of the program. Those who survive are transformed over the course of those years into something that transcends ordinary human biology in almost every measurable way: taller, stronger, faster, more durable, with additional senses and physiological systems that have no equivalent in unaugmented humanity. Yes, the making of a Custodian makes that process look almost straightforward by comparison. Potential candidates are identified and claimed from a very young age. We are talking about infants, taken no later than late infancy, because the fundamental changes that will be wrought upon their flesh, their minds, and something the sources describe as their souls are so all-encompassing that the subject must be as young as possible simply to survive what is about to happen to them. In the current era, the 41st and now 42nd millennia, it remains considered a profound honor within the great noble families of Terra to offer a child for consideration, a tradition that stretches back to the Unification Wars themselves. But the Custodians also seek out candidates through their own mysterious channels, appearing unannounced at locations across the throne world, following criteria that they have never revealed to any outside party, and that even those within the Order understand only partially. Once a candidate is accepted, what follows is not years of training in any conventional sense. It is decades of alchemical augmentation, of psychological reshaping on the most fundamental level, of mimetic conditioning so deep and so thorough that loyalty to the Emperor becomes not a conviction but a feature of the subject's fundamental neurology, something as basic and as unavoidable as the need to breathe. The candidate's psyche is crafted as deliberately and carefully as his body, shaped with the precision of a master gemsmith cutting a perfect stone. Yes, the comparison is deliberate, and it is apt. If at any stage of the process the merest flaw is detected, the candidate is not failed out and reassigned to some other purpose. He is discarded. The creation of a Custodian tolerates no imperfection, because what a Custodian is created to do tolerates no imperfection. What emerges from this process is categorically unlike a Space Marine, and not merely in degree. A Space Marine is an enhanced human, shaped by his gene seed into something extraordinary. A custodian is further still, something that the lore explicitly compares more to what the Primarchs represented in terms of the nature and depth of the transformation. More stable than the Thunder Warriors were, more refined than anything else the Imperium has produced before or since. Is it more capable not just in the physical dimensions of strength, speed, and durability, but in every other dimension of their being simultaneously? Their intelligence, their judgment, their capacity for independent thought, their cultural sophistication. Physically, a custodian in the 41st Millennium stands close to 9 feet tall, even without their helm. Their physiology operates at levels that make a Space Marine's enhanced biology look, if not modest exactly, then at least comprehensible within the same framework of analysis. A custodian's musculature generates forces that challenge the limits of what Auramite-reinforced structures can withstand. Their reaction times are so swift that combat engagements with ordinary humans or even lightly enhanced warriors operate almost in slow motion from their perspective. Their pain tolerance is so complete that wounds that would incapacitate or kill most beings simply do not register in any way that affects their combat effectiveness. They can regenerate from injuries that would be permanently disabling for a Space Marine. And their lifespans are measured not in decades but in centuries. The oldest among the custodians have been serving in their role for over 1,000 years, their bodies simply declining to deteriorate in the way that aging normally demands. But physical capability, as impressive as it is not what makes the custodians extraordinary in the most important sense. It is their minds that set them apart as much as their bodies. The custodians are scholars. They are philosophers. They are expected and required to engage in debate on matters of history, strategy, military theory, political philosophy, art, and human culture with the same fluency and skill that they bring to close combat. This was deliberately designed into them from the beginning. The Emperor built his personal guard to be people he could actually speak with, people whose minds could occupy some of the same conceptual space as his own, at least to a degree. The result is that even a relatively junior member of the Adeptus Custodes in the current era is not merely a superlative fighting machine. He is a walking repository of thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, capable of advising on matters that range from tactical doctrine to the philosophical implications of governance. One practice that grew from this philosophical dimension of their nature is the granting of individual names, where Space Marines have ranks and designations. Where ordinary soldiers have serial numbers and unit identifications, custodians accumulate names. Each additional name is an honorific earned through a deed of sufficient significance to merit acknowledgement by the custodian's internal recognition systems. The first Captain General of the Custodes, Constantine Valdor, had accumulated 1,932 individual names by the time the Horus Heresy reached Terra. By the current era, his full name, preserved if it has been preserved at all in the archives of the custodians themselves, would presumably fill an entire volume with honorifics earned across millennia of service. This system speaks to how deeply the custodians are shaped around individual identity and individual achievement. They are not interchangeable components of a larger machine, and each one is a specific, unrepeatable, irreplaceable investment in the future of the human species, and their culture reflects that understanding. And yet, for all their individual magnificence, their numbers are deliberately and brutally small. At their full strength, the custodians number 10,000. Not 10,000 per chapter or per legion, 10,000 total. That is the name by which they are known among those few in the Imperium who have heard of them at all, the 10,000. By the era of Guilliman's return at the close of the 41st Millennium, their Captain General Trajan Valoris acknowledges that their forces are only slightly below that famous number, slightly depleted through the rare but devastating engagements of the long Vigil years, and through the slow attrition of service that even the most extraordinary warriors cannot entirely escape across 10 millennia. 10,000 warriors to guard an empire of 1,000,000 worlds. The mathematics of that might seem almost comically insufficient until you sit with what each individual custodian is actually capable of. One squad of 6 custodians, according to recorded Imperium lore, held back a Tyranid hive fleet's ground forces without casualties. A single custodian has been observed in the sources defeating multiple Space Marines simultaneously without apparent difficulty. The lore is consistent on this. They are not merely better soldiers. They are something from a different tier of existence, operating in combat the way a master craftsman operates in their workshop. Yet with a quality and efficiency that simply does not compare to what anyone else in the same setting can produce. Part 3. The Arsenal of Living Gods, Weapons and Armor. Let us walk through what a custodian actually carries into battle, because the equipment tells the story of an organization that has never had to accept the constraints that shape ordinary military logistics. The custodians do not use mass-produced war gear. They do not draw from the same supply chains that equip billions of soldiers across the vast military machine of the Imperium. What they carry instead is something that might more reasonably be described as a collection of irreplaceable artifacts, each one unique, each one crafted by hands whose methods are guarded across generations within specially designated armoring families on Terra. It's the Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars, for all its pride and technical mastery, does not have access to these methods, a fact that has been a source of considerable and sometimes dangerous friction throughout the long centuries of Imperial history. The knowledge belongs to Terra, and Terra keeps it. The armor of the Custodians is built from a material called auramite. This is worth spending some time on, because auramite is genuinely extraordinary and not at all just a better version of ceramite, the substance from which Space Marine armor is constructed. Auramite is described in the sources as a material of unknown and possibly alien provenance, extraordinarily rare, naturally golden in color, in ways that make it inherently appropriate for the Emperor's personal guardians. But its properties go far beyond its appearance, and each suit of custodian armor is custom-built for a specific individual, fitted precisely to that custodian's exact physique, calibrated to his personal fighting style, worked over by master artisans whose skills are the product of lifetimes of dedicated craft. The finished product is described in the sources as each being a planet's ransom in worth, and that is not hyperbole designed for narrative effect. When you account for the rarity of the materials, the skill of the craftsman, and the sheer time involved in producing one suit, the comparison holds. Auramite has one property in particular that distinguishes it from ceramite in ways that matter enormously to the role the custodians play. It is, to use the technical language that Imperial scholars apply to it, almost inert at a quantum level. What that means in practical terms is that it does not impede the manipulation of psychic energy the way ceramite does. Standard Space Marine armor provides its wearers with a degree of passive protection against warp energy by dampening psychic effects, useful for warriors who regularly face opponents who rely on those effects. But auramite allows warp energy to pass through more freely, which means a custodian wearing it can engage with psychic threats on their own terms. The Emperor wore auramite himself when seated on the Golden Throne, performing the kind of immaterial battle against demonic intrusion that would have burned bare flesh away with the sheer energy involved. Yet the properties that allowed the Emperor to perform that work are the same properties that give every suit of custodian armor its particular relationship to the forces of the warp. Each suit is then further enhanced beyond the material itself, with arrays of proximity sensors and refraction field generators, early warning systems, and additional layers of active protection that supplement the passive defense of the armor. The gemstones set into each suit are not purely decorative, though they are also that. They identify the wearer's shield company, they carry records of significant engagements, and some of them are sourced from deposits deep within Terra itself that have not been accessible to anyone outside the custodians in living memory. And then there are the weapons. The Guardian Spear is the signature armament of the Adeptus Custodes, is carried since the Unification Wars, depicted on their banners and their badges, recognized across every culture in the Imperium as the symbol of these golden warriors and everything they represent. It is a halberd-like power weapon on such a scale that it would take several ordinary men working together simply to lift it off the ground. And yet in the hands of a custodian it moves with blinding speed, spinning in great arcs that trace paths of destruction through enemy formations. The power field surrounding the blade crackles with contained energy and will cut through almost any material encountered on the battlefield. The edge of that field, when it connects with a target, transfers energy in ways that make the Guardian Spear's physical blade only part of what it is doing, but the Guardian Spear is also a ranged weapon. Inbuilt into the head of the spear is a highly advanced integrated bolt weapon, capable of laying down fire against targets at significant range. In battle, a custodian can switch between devastating long-reach melee strikes and accurate ranged fire without needing to change weapons, giving them a tactical flexibility that compounds their already extraordinary individual capability. They are engaging targets before those targets reach melee range, and then killing whatever survives the approach at arm's length with the powered blade. The combination is elegantly vicious. For the most noted shield captains and senior figures within the 10,000, the standard Guardian Spear is replaced by the Paragon Spear, more beautifully crafted still, incorporating a Paragon bolter of exceptional quality, in each weapon carrying personal history inscribed in its metal. These are not just armaments. They are the physical records of centuries of dedicated service, handed down and built upon, as the custodian who carries them adds their own deeds to its story. Beyond the spears, the custodians carry weapons that simply do not exist elsewhere in the Imperium. Adrathic disintegration weapons, technology so rare and so devastating that its operational effect on most targets verges on the genuinely horrifying, even by the uncompromising standards of 41st Millennium warfare. Adrathic weapons disrupt matter at a molecular level, leaving nothing behind, converting their targets into scattered energies with a completeness that is genuinely impressive to observe and genuinely sobering to think about. The psychological effect on enemy forces who witness one of their number simply vanish under the beam of an Adrathic weapon is reportedly significant and immediate. The Custodians do not share this technology with anyone, not the Space Marines, not the Mechanicus, not the Inquisition. It belongs to the 10,000, and it stays with them. Those Custodians who ride into battle on the legendary Dawn Eagle jet bikes, the mounted warriors of the Cataphractoi caste, represent one of the most visually striking sights in the entire 41st Millennium. The bikes themselves are masterworks of anti-gravity technology, capable of speeds that make conventional vehicles look fixed in place. The riders carry lances and hurricane bolters, go sweeping through enemy formations with a combination of speed and firepower that can break entire defensive lines before those lines have time to properly respond. They have served in this role since the Great Crusade era, and the sight of them descending on an enemy flank remains one of the more arresting things you can witness on an Imperial battlefield. Part 4. Walking Beside a Living God. The Great Crusade. When the Emperor finally unified Terra and turned his extraordinary gaze outward to the stars, the Great Crusade that followed was the largest military operation in human history, a campaign so vast in scale that the mere logistics of it dwarf anything that has been attempted before or since. Hundreds of thousands of Space Marines in their legions swept across the galaxy. The Primarchs? Those superhuman sons of the Emperor, scattered across the stars in infancy and now recovered and given command, led forces of world-cracking capability. Alien empires that had expanded into the void left behind by humanity's long absence were burned away. Lost human colonies were reclaimed and brought back under the light of the Imperium. The darkness of the Age of Strife was being systematically rolled back, sector by sector, world by world. In the midst of that vast undertaking, with its millions of soldiers and hundreds of ships and the collective logistical weight of an empire being built from scratch across the entire galaxy, the Legio Custodes numbered 10,000, and they went with the Emperor wherever he went. This is worth pausing on carefully. Just the Emperor did not remain behind on Terra as some kind of living administrative presence while his Primarchs waged the crusade in his name. He went. For the greatest battles, the most significant moments of conquest and diplomacy and civilizational reclamation, he was present in person, and the battles he chose to participate in directly tended to reach their conclusions very quickly. And always, striding at his side in their gleaming auramite, wielding blades and spears that crackled with fell energies, were the 10,000. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, fought at some point in the later stages of the Great Crusade, offers one of the most compelling documented examples of the Custodians deployed as a full fighting force. Yes, the campaign was brought about by an alien threat of extraordinary magnitude, a greenskin warlord of a scale rarely encountered, named Garkul Blackfang, who had grown powerful enough during humanity's long absence from the stars to represent a genuine strategic threat to the entire campaign. The scale of the momentum built behind Blackfang was such that conventional forces were struggling to bring it to a definitive end. The Legio Custodes fought in that engagement alongside the Emperor, and the combination proved decisive in the way that the Emperor's direct personal participation in any battle tended to prove decisive. But the role of the Custodians during the Great Crusade era was not purely martial. and it is important to understand the full spectrum of what they did. They were also the Emperor's emissaries. His representatives in situations where the presence of a full Space Marine Legion would be politically complicated, or where the specific authority of the Emperor himself needed to be felt, without the Emperor actually appearing in person. When a custodian arrived at a world on behalf of the Emperor, there was no ambiguity about what that arrival meant. No Primarch casually disrespected a custodian. No Legion commander questioned the authority those golden warriors carried with them. The presence of the 10,000 was a statement of such unambiguous weight that entire political situations could be resolved simply by their appearance. During this period, one practice emerged that perfectly captures the specific way the custodians thought about their mission and about security in general: the blood games. Not combat exercises in any conventional sense, something far more creative, far more characteristic of how these warriors approached the question of keeping the Emperor safe. In the blood games, individual custodians working alone would adopt the mindset of an enemy, a potential assassin or infiltrator, and attempt to penetrate whatever defensive cordon they were tasked with testing. They would probe for vulnerabilities, exploit gaps in security protocols, use every technique available to a patient and capable attacker, and then they would report back with their findings, and the security would be updated and tightened accordingly. The origin of the blood games is traced in one compelling account to an incident involving the Primarch Alfarius, the Mediziribistum Ivir, Simbium Umbesi Dorestibi Bibidibischirismas Tenaibubi Sigibidi, ended in Bizizad, the Gidstoadi Stabextus. Dam Bimbijebi said Bigibit the Dimid might be beat squad, the beat, and this OM Perstem the Bizani Shin Bishosam, whose entire identity and operational philosophy was built around infiltration, deception, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities others could not see. Alfarius, according to this account, personally infiltrated the Imperial Palace during the early Great Crusade, killed and assumed the identity of a specific custodian named Gerudo, and ultimately managed to override one of the palace's defensive turrets in a way that would have given him the theoretical capability to shoot the Emperor's own shuttle from the sky. He then walked into Captain General Valdor's presence and calmly explained exactly what he had done and every step by which he had done it. The most effective argument for systematic security testing that anyone had ever made, delivered in the most pointed possible way. After the heresy, when the custodians were largely confined to Terra and no longer fighting the wide variety of enemies that their previous operational tempo had exposed them to, the blood games evolved further. A specialized corps was established to find suitable opponents from across the Imperium, including remarkably Chaos Space Marines recovered from ongoing conflicts, who would then be released within the controlled environment of the Imperial Palace complex to serve as genuine threats for the Custodians to test themselves against. The logic was unsentimental. The only way to stay prepared for real threats is to face something close enough to those threats to maintain the relevant skills and mindset. The blood games became an institution so embedded in custodian culture that knowledge built up through decades of escalating exercises gave them capabilities that surprised even their enemies when they eventually returned to active external deployment. Part 5. The War Nobody Knew. The Webway Conflict. Here is one of the most extraordinary, most tragic, and least celebrated stories in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. It takes place almost entirely in secret, fought in a dimension that most people in the 41st millennium cannot access at all. It costs the Emperor everything. It costs the Custodians approximately 90% of their active strength. It locks the Emperor onto the Golden Throne for the rest of time. And it sets in motion the chain of events that defines the next 10,000 years of human history. Oh, if any single event in the Warhammer 40,000 setting could be called the pivot on which everything else turns, this might be it. The Imperial Webway Project. The Emperor had a dream that went beyond even the Great Crusade. Not content with merely conquering the galaxy through the traditional methods of military force and political unification, he was simultaneously pursuing something that would change the fundamental nature of human civilization if it succeeded. The Webway, the ancient transit network, built by the Eldar over millions of years, a system of tunnels through the fabric of space that allowed travel across vast distances without using the warp, could in theory be extended and adapted for human use. If the Emperor could tame a portion of that network and make it accessible to the Imperium, and then human ships and human travelers would have access to routes that bypass the Immaterium entirely. No exposure to the entities that dwell in chaos. No risk of the catastrophic navigation failures that could strand ships between the stars for decades. No leverage for the ruinous powers to exercise over a species that needed their realm for transit. The long-term implications were extraordinary to contemplate. The project was being conducted in the deepest, most secure dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace, hidden from almost everyone, requiring the Emperor's constant personal psychic attention to maintain the wards and structures that kept it stable. It was going well. Until Magnus the Red committed an act of irony so profound and so catastrophic that it defies easy description. Magnus, the Primarch of the Thousand Sons and the most gifted psyker among all the Emperor's sons, had foreseen through his sorceress abilities that Horus was about to betray the Emperor and plunge the galaxy into civil war. Desperate to warn his father, and lacking any other means of reaching him quickly enough, Magnus used forbidden psychic sorcery to send a warning directly to the Emperor's mind. In doing so, he shattered the psychic wards that the Emperor had so carefully maintained around the Webway project. The breach he created did not merely disrupt the project, it opened a portal. And through that portal, the demonic entities of chaos, which had been pressing against the boundary of the physical realm with patience born of timeless hunger, flooded in. The Emperor faced choices with no good options. Abandoning the Webway portal was not possible while chaos forces were pouring through it, because doing so would allow an unlimited flood of demons directly into the heart of the Imperial Palace, and from there into Terra itself. So, instead the Emperor did the only thing that would hold the breach. He sat down on the Golden Throne, originally built as the mechanism for navigating the Webway, and repurposed it as a device for maintaining the psychic wards from the inside, channeling his full attention and his full psychic might into the work of keeping the portal from becoming the end of everything, trapping himself in the process. And then he sent the Custodians in. For years, some accounts say 5, some say longer, the Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence fought a war that almost nobody in the broader Imperium knew was happening. Into the Horus heresy was consuming the galaxy. Legions were turning on each other. The Emperor's Primarchs were engaged in the greatest fratricide in history, and the entire time, the 10,000 were fighting a different war, in a different dimension, against an enemy that had no limit to the forces it could bring to bear. They established defensive positions in the abandoned Eldar city of Kalistar, which the Imperial forces grimly nicknamed the Impossible City, and from those positions they conducted the kind of fighting that the records of the era describe, in terms that make even the bloodiest surface battles of the heresy look almost measured. Greater demons of every chaos power, tearing through custodians who would not yield ground. The Sisters of Silence, the psychic null warriors who made demonic manifestation in their presence painfully difficult and who fought alongside the Custodians as the talons of the Emperor, dying in numbers that diminished their already small force with terrible speed. The scale and relentlessness of the demonic tide was something that even warriors built specifically to be capable of anything found genuinely testing. The Legio Custodes were reduced to approximately 10% of their original strength before the crisis reached its breaking point. Think carefully about what that means in concrete terms. The 10,000 were ground down to roughly 1,000 survivors. 2 of the 3 commanding tribunes were killed in the fighting. The Impossible City fell when Chaos Titans of the Legio Audax breached the walls. The surviving Imperial forces, betrayed by Mechanicum allies who broke and fled in a desperate attempt to secure a route back to Mars, were driven all the way back to the gate leading to Terra itself. Tribune Ray Endymion, who had assumed command of the surviving Custodians after the deaths of his fellow tribunes, became the figure at the center of the war's most extraordinary moment. Ra had accumulated 871 individual names of honor by the time of the heresy. He had been claimed by the Custodians as an infant from circumstances that were themselves dramatic, his mother killed by Constantine Valdor himself for the crime of stealing one of Terra's last oceans. A small biographical detail that somehow perfectly encapsulates the scale at which the early Imperium operated. He had risen to tribune through 800 years of devoted service. And at the end, when the Emperor himself briefly left the Golden Throne to intervene personally in the webway, it was Ra who paid the final price. When the Emperor confronted the ancient demon Drachnyen in the ruins of Kalistar, a being described as one of the most primordial and powerful entities Chaos had ever produced, taking the form of the first human being who had ever killed another human being, and found that the only way to contain it was to bind it into living flesh. It was Ra who received the terrible gift. The Emperor hurled the demon's sword directly into Ra Endymion's body. The daemon was bound. Ra was sent walking into the depths of the webway, carrying his terrible passenger with him, his fate unknown. Almost nobody in the Imperium of the 41st Millennium knows this story. And the records were classified to levels that virtually no living being can access. The consequences of the Webway War, however, are visible everywhere. The Emperor permanently on the Golden Throne. The Webway project ended. The Imperium's continued dependence on the warp for travel, and all the existential horror that dependence entails. The Astronomicon burning at the cost of 1,000 psychers every day. Everything that came after flows from those years in the impossible city. Part 6. The Day That Broke Them. The Siege of Terra. If the Webway War was the hidden tragedy, the Siege of Terra was the visible one, the culmination of the Horus heresy. The moment when the galaxy-consuming rebellion that had torn the Emperor's closest family apart finally arrived at the Emperor's own door. And every nightmare that the Custodians had been built to prevent became real. Horus came to Saul with the full weight of his corrupted legions behind him. Traitor space marines twisted and reshaped by the gifts of chaos, their gene seed corrupted, their minds open to things that should never have been invited in. Demonic entities given physical form by the depth of corruption that surrounded them. War machines of unimaginable destructive capacity. The combined forces of 4 ruinous powers, unified under a war master who had once been the Emperor's greatest champion and most trusted son, and was now something that the universe had decided to make into its instrument of revenge against the light the Emperor was trying to build. And by the time that siege began, the Custodians were already significantly diminished. In the years in the Webway had reduced their numbers by 90%. The survivors were perhaps the most battle-tested warriors in the history of the Imperium, veterans of engagements that made the conventional battles of the heresy look almost straightforward by comparison, but they were few, very few. The full weight of their original 10,000 was gone, sacrificed in a hidden war for the sake of a project that was now forever abandoned. They held anyway. Against everything that Horus could direct at the walls of the Imperial Palace, the Custodians held. Chaos space marines of every corrupted legion, who were capable enough to reach the inner walls, hardened veterans who had been fighting for years and enhanced beyond their original capability by the gifts of the dark gods, just were cut apart by golden warriors fighting with a fury that was not the fury of battle rage, but something quieter and more absolute. The total conviction that the line must not break here, because if it broke here, everything ended. And then the Emperor made his decision. The boarding action against Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, hanging in orbit above the burning world below. The Emperor gathered a small force, a handful of Custodians, a small contingent of Imperial fists, and they teleported directly onto that ship, into the heart of the enemy, into Horus's territory, surrounded by every traitor who could reach that engagement. The Custodians who went with the Emperor fought with absolutely everything they had. They cut through the fiercest traitors Horus could place in their path. They held nothing back, and it was not enough. Horus was not merely a corrupted Primarch by that stage of the conflict. He had become something fundamentally different, a living conduit for the combined power of 4 chaos deities simultaneously, a figure of such immense and distorted power that even the Emperor himself, in open combat against his fallen son, was brought to the edge of total defeat. Sanguinius, the angel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, was killed by Horus before the Emperor could reach him. And then the Emperor himself was wounded, mortally wounded. Horus, in an act of either final mercy or deliberate cruelty, depending on which interpretation of his psychology you find more convincing, refrained from delivering the killing blow. And that moment of hesitation cost him everything. The Emperor destroyed him utterly. It's in a conflagration of psychic power that ended the arch-traitor's physical existence. But the cost was absolute. The Emperor was broken, carried back to Terra by his surviving Custodians, placed on the golden throne in the last act of imperial surgery, his consciousness still present but his body reduced to a barely functioning shell that would never recover. The Custodians donned mourning black and stood their somber watch over the ruin of everything they had been created to protect, and the guilt that entered them on that day has never fully left. Part 7, 10,000 Years of Vigil, The Long Watch. If you want to understand the psychological weight that has shaped the Adeptus Custodes from the final moments of the Horus Heresy all the way to the present moment in the 40k narrative, you need to stay with one specific fact for a while before moving on. For approximately 10,000 years, a span of time so vast that the entirety of recorded human civilization, before the Age of Strife fits within it several times over, the Custodians stood watch over an emperor who could not move, could not speak in ways that ordinary people could understand, and could not walk among his subjects. An emperor reduced to a broken remnant of flesh and bone and immeasurable will, kept alive by the extraordinary and gradually failing machinery of the Golden Throne, and by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, whose souls are consumed each day to sustain the psychic light that the Emperor still provides. The Astronomicon, the beacon that allows warp navigation across the Imperium, still burns, dimly, with what remains of his psychic output. Without it, there is no reliable warp travel. Without it, the Imperium of man collapses into isolated fragments that would be consumed piecemeal by every darkness that presses in from outside. Billions of humans living and dying and building their lives in the ordinary routines of the 41st millennium exist only because the Emperor still burns. And the Emperor still burns, in part, because the Custodians have kept faith. The collective guilt of the Adeptus Custodes is one of the most interesting and most underappreciated aspects of their lore. It is not the guilt of warriors who fought poorly, or who were cowardly, or who made the wrong choices in the heat of battle. They fought magnificently in the webway. Yet they held the imperial palace against forces that should have broken any conventional defense. They stood with the emperor on the vengeful spirit and gave everything they had to give. But the emperor still fell. And in the internal logic of a culture built around the singular purpose of protecting a single individual from harm, there is no excuse for that outcome, no context that adequately explains it, no recourse to circumstances or overwhelming odds. The emperor was hurt while they lived. That will never be acceptable to them. This guilt is visible in specific ways throughout their history. The donning of mourning black in the immediate aftermath of the heresy. The centuries of inward focus, of refusing deployments beyond Terra, that might have altered the trajectory of an Imperium slowly rotting from the inside outward. Yet the elaborate complexity of the Blood Games, which can be read as an exercise in obsessive self-criticism, an endless search for the vulnerability that will never again be allowed to exist. The Custodians have spent 10,000 years trying to be worthy of a responsibility they failed once and can never be certain of fulfilling until the moment of its next test. Meanwhile, the Imperium around them evolved in ways that would have deeply troubled the Emperor if he had been able to observe them clearly. The ecclesiarchy grew from a small administrative office into a galaxy-spanning religious institution that had made an actual god out of a man who had specifically and explicitly rejected worship as an organizing principle for human civilization. Yet the High Lords of Terra accumulated extraordinary personal purin, sometimes used it for personal enrichment rather than the good of the species. The Adeptus Mechanicus had transformed technical knowledge into a mystery cult. Corruption took root in 1,000 departments and institutions and gradually spread from the edges inward. The living empire that the Emperor had built was turning into something he would not have recognized. The Custodians saw all of this. They understood what was happening, and they stayed on Terra, because that is where the Emperor was, and the Emperor was why they existed. The relationship between the Adeptus Custodes and the High Lords of Terra during the long millennium of the Vigil is one of the more peculiar institutional arrangements in a setting full of peculiar institutional arrangements. Yes, the Captain General held a seat among the High Lords in certain extraordinary circumstances, a formal recognition of the Custodians' institutional position within the Imperium. But the Custodians' primary concern was never the business of governance. Even Space Marine chapter masters were required to kneel before Custodians. The formal recording practices of the Imperium declared any war zone the Custodians deployed to an Imperial victory automatically before the battle even began, a bureaucratic expression of faith in their capability that also served as a useful deterrent for anyone considering challenging them. The isolation of those 10,000 years was profound. New Custodians were created to replace the losses of the heresy and the rare engagements that followed. But the rate of creation was slow, and the knowledge was carefully held. Individual Custodians who had been alive during the Great Crusade found themselves in the strange position of being, after several centuries, among the longest-serving members of an institution that had largely forgotten what external deployment felt like. Their culture deepened, and in some ways narrowed, focused ever more intensely on the single purpose that remained constant: keep the Emperor alive, keep the Golden Throne functioning, keep the portal in the webway sealed, keep the Astronomicon burning, and do it forever, if that is what it takes. Part 8. The Structure of the 10,000. Organization. Before we get to the seismic events of the Era Indomitus and what they mean for the Custodians' future, it is worth taking the time to understand how the Adeptus Custodes are actually organized and structured. Because while their numbers are small, their internal architecture is genuinely fascinating and reveals a great deal about how they think about themselves and their mission. At the very top of the hierarchy sits the Captain General. The title might sound simple, but the role is extraordinary in scope. The Captain General is the supreme military commander of the Adeptus Custodes, their representative in the highest councils of the Imperium, the figure who plans their strategic deployments personally, the individual who bears ultimate responsibility for the defense of not just the Imperial Palace, but the entire Sol system. He must possess, according to the organization's own internal standards, a level of individual combat prowess that approaches that of the Primarchs of old. In the 10,000 years since the Horus Heresy, there have been only 17 holders of this title. Most have died in battle, several became Eyes of the Emperor, and 3, including Constantine Valdor himself, simply vanished from the historical record, their fates unknown, even to their own organization. Below the Captain General sit 2 tribunes, senior officers whose roles in the current era are primarily concerned with ceremony, institutional memory, and the maintenance of the most sacred traditions of the Adeptus Custodes. During the Horus Heresy era, there were 3 tribunes. The reduction to 2 reflects both the losses of the heresy and the way the organization has adapted over the following millennia. Below the tribunes, some individual squads and operational units are overseen by shield captains, the most veteran, most knowledgeable, and most experienced warriors within the organization, individuals whose accumulated judgment can be trusted in situations that fall outside any established protocol or procedure. The broader operational groupings are the Shield Company, typically a contingent of several squads of Custodians, a Vexillus Praetor who carries the company's sacred standard, and various specialist elements depending on the mission, and the Shield Host, which is a larger formation of multiple shield companies organized around a particular strategic objective or operational philosophy. Different shield hosts develop their own specific cultures and specializations over time. And the Shadowkeepers who guard the vaults and dungeons beneath the palace wear black because some duties are performed in darkness and the color makes the point without any need for explanation. The Solar Watch maintains white armor. Others maintain the traditional gold, but distinguish themselves through the colors of their robes and the gems worked into their plate. Within the broader Custodian organization, there are also 5 castes defined by combat role and war gear, each named from Greek and Byzantine military tradition. The Haikonatoi, from the Byzantine military designation for the able ones, are the rank-and-file infantry, the Custodian Guard who form the backbone of any deployment. The Cataphractoi are the mounted forces, the jet bike riders who function as fast-moving cavalry. The Theranatoi are the Terminator equivalent, elite shock troops in the heaviest available armor. The Sagittarum are the range specialists, fewer in number, focused on long-range fire support and outer perimeter sentinel duties. And the Moritoi are those Custodians who have been so grievously wounded in battle that they have been interred within dreadnought frames, living still, fighting still, but mourned by their brothers for what has been lost, even as their continued service is honored. Beyond these formal structures, several specialized organizations within the broader Custodian Corps deserve particular attention. The Ephoroi Condim conduct covert operations, counterintelligence work, assassination, and infiltration, the shadow side of an organization that is usually known for very direct expressions of force. During the Great Crusade era, they reportedly commanded the Officio Assassinorum itself. The Shadow Keepers patrol the vaults and dungeons, where the most dangerous things the Imperium has ever captured are locked away from the light, things that cannot be destroyed and cannot be released, and must simply be contained forever. A job description that says something interesting about the scope of what the Custodians guard. The Emissaries Imperatus serve as formal heralds of the Golden Throne, appearing wherever the Emperor's authority needs to be expressed through physical presence. The eyes of the Emperor are those who have formally stepped back from active service, custodians who are old even by the extraordinary standards of this organization, who have decided that their most valuable contribution is surveillance and intelligence rather than direct combat, and who operate as an invisible network of observers scattered throughout the Imperium's highest institutions. Part 9. Men Who Became Myths. Notable Custodians. No exploration of the Adeptus Custodes is complete without taking the time to know some of the specific individuals who have defined this organization across its extraordinary history. The Custodians are a culture of individuals, and their notable figures carry stories that illuminate the whole in ways that organizational structures and tactical analyses cannot. Constantine Valdor stands above all others as the defining figure of the Custodian legacy. The first of the 10,000, the Emperor's Spear. Yet the chief custodian who was present for everything from the earliest battles of the Unification Wars through the desperate final moments of the Horus Heresy at the gates of the Imperial Palace. His origins are as deliberately obscured as the origin of the organization he led. The sources say that the Emperor personally ordered the deaths of Valdor's biological parents and moved entire armies across continents to locate and retrieve the child. Valdor himself recalled almost nothing of his life before entering the Emperor's service, the process of becoming a custodian having replaced whatever he had been before with something new and singular and entirely committed. Over the course of his service, Valdor accumulated 1,932 individual names representing honorific deeds. He fought on the burning world of Prospero alongside Leman Russ and the Space Wolves against the sorcerers of the Thousand Suns, killing at least 3 of Magnus's greatest psychers and defeating forces considerably more numerous than his own contingent. He stood on the War Council during the Heresy alongside Malcador the Sigillite and Rogal Dorn, debating the ethics of assassination as a tool of war in ways that reveal a mind genuinely grappling with the hardest questions of governance. He wielded the Apollonian spear, forged by the Emperor's own hand, granted to Valdor, never carried by any other being. And then, after the heresy ended, and the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, Valdor handed the Captain Generalcy to a successor and walked out of the Imperial Palace in the dead of night. He paused at the threshold, and turned back to look at the palace one final time, whispered the first half of the famous Imperial saying, "Only in death," and then disappeared. No death was recorded, no destination was noted, no explanation was ever given even to his fellow custodians. The greatest of the 10,000 simply walked into history and did not return. In the 41st millennium, the mystery of Valdor has taken on dimensions that are simultaneously more concrete and more unsettling. Dan Abnett's Bequeen novels introduce a mysterious figure known as the King in Yellow, a being who appears to have spent approximately 10 millennia assembling secret forces and resources, operating through proxies and hidden networks that reach across the Imperium and beyond. When the investigators in those novels finally unravel enough of the mystery, yet the figure beneath it is identified as bearing the name Constantine Valdor, what he has been doing in the shadows for 10,000 years, whether the goals he is pursuing are compatible with the Imperium's survival or represent a different and perhaps incompatible vision for humanity's future, these remain among the most tantalizing open questions in all of contemporary 40k fiction. It should be noted that this material comes from Black Library Fiction and represents one possible in-universe interpretation. Games Workshop has not formally resolved the question of Valdor's fate in Codex material. Tribune Ra Endymion deserves far more recognition than he typically receives in popular 40k discussion. As described in the Webway section, Ra was a tribune who gave everything to a war nobody else even knew was happening. and whose reward was an eternity carrying a demon in his flesh through the corridors of a dimension outside normal space. He was extraordinary by any conceivable measure, and his story is one of the most striking examples in the setting of what devotion to a cause can actually cost. And in the current era, there is Trajan Valoris, the 17th Captain General, the man the lore describes as possibly the deadliest individual warrior in the entire Imperium, a combatant whose skill explicitly approaches that of the Primarchs. He is described as an imposing, coldly deliberate figure with a severely scarred face, a detail remarkable for a being of his extraordinary physiological resilience, suggesting that whatever caused those scars was genuinely exceptional. He carries the Watcher's Axe, a devastatingly powerful relic weapon, and alongside the Moment Shackle, an artifact of Dark Age technology that the lore suggests gives him an uncanny ability to anticipate how events will unfold. Originally an Alaris Custodian, he ran 2 successful blood games before his elevation to Captain General, a record that has never been matched. Under Valoris, the Adeptus Custodes have become more proactive than at any point since the Age of Apostasy. The number of blood games conducted has increased tenfold. 32 separate extrasolar interdiction strikes were launched against threats before those threats could approach the Sol system. Hidden cults in Terra's Underhive were purged. The stable warp routes into the Sol system were substantially reinforced, and when Guilliman returned, Valoris was prepared. His particular gift for anticipating what was coming had given the Custodians the preparation time they needed to be ready for the change that was about to arrive. Part 10. The Era Indomitus. Golden Warriors Unbound. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Custodes were defined by restraint, not by incapacity, by deliberate choice, by the internal logical framework that had governed every aspect of their operation since the Emperor first declared their purpose. They stood their watch, they guarded their master, they kept the darkness from the door of the Sanctum Imperialis. And beyond that door, the Imperium slowly decayed, and they watched that too, and they stayed where they were. Then, Cadia fell. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler breached the defenses of the Cadian Gate, the system that had served as the primary bulwark against chaos forces pouring from the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. With Cadia destroyed, the Eye of Terror expanded. The Great Rift tore across the galaxy from one edge to the other, a wound in reality that divided the Imperium into the Imperium Sanctus, where the Emperor's light could still be seen, and the Imperium Nihilus in the darkness beyond, where the Astronomicon no longer reached and billions of human beings were cut off from everything. Warp storms consumed entire systems. For the first time since the Horus Heresy, the Imperium was at genuine risk of total fragmentation. Then Robut Guilliman woke up. The 13th son of the Emperor, the master of Ultramar, the most talented administrator and strategist among the Primarchs, yet the man who had rebuilt the Imperium once after the Horus Heresy, and who now found himself confronted with the task of doing it again in circumstances he described with evident anguish as worse than anything he could have imagined. He met with the Emperor privately for an entire day, and what passed between them in the Sanctum Imperialis is not recorded anywhere that anyone outside can access. When Guilliman emerged, his expression told everyone who saw him that whatever he had found in that room had shaken him deeply. And then he went to work with the organized urgency of someone who has no time to waste and an infinite number of things to do. Part of what he addressed was the Edict of Restraint, the old protocol that had kept the Custodians bound to Terra since the closing years of the heresy. In consultation with Tron Valoris, in sessions that the historical record describes as extended and at times genuinely tense, the edict was amended, not abolished entirely. A standing force of Custodians, the Companions, were designated to remain permanently at the Emperor's side, never leaving, the last line of defense that would never move. But the broader Custodian host was freed to operate beyond Terra in ways they had not done in 10,000 years. The results were immediate and dramatic. Custodian detachments joined every fleet of the Indomitus Crusade, the massive military operation Guilliman launched to reclaim the shattered Imperium. Torchbearer expeditions, each containing a squad of Custodians alongside Sisters of Silence and Biologist Magi, were dispatched to Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, it bearing new Primaris Space Marine technology and Gene Seed as emissaries of the new Lord Commander. Their presence was deliberately chosen. No Space Marine chapter, however traditional or suspicious of the new Primaris warriors that Guilliman was distributing, would refuse a gift delivered by the Emperor's own custodians. The weight of that identity could not be delegated to any lesser messenger. On Terra itself, the consequences of the Great Rift arrived directly and physically. Cornate demonic forces attacked the Imperial Palace, not as a metaphorical threat, not as a distant concern to be monitored, but as an actual invading army beating against the walls of the most sacred and most defended place in human history. For the first time since the siege of Terra itself, the Golden Warriors fought in literal defense of the throne world. 4,000 custodians marched out to defend the palace in what became known as the Second Siege of Terra. More than half of them were lost in the fighting. The battle was won, but the losses were described by those who witnessed them as staggering and sobering, a reminder that the 10,000 were extraordinary but not invulnerable, and that the universe had changed in ways that made the old strategies of passive defense around a single location no longer sufficient for the task of actually protecting the Emperor's interests in any meaningful sense. Valorous understood this with the clarity that his particular personality and the experience of the siege demanded. His famous words, that a wise man draws his swords when the time is right, and a fool dies with blades still sheathed, were the public expression of a private reckoning that the entire custodian organization was undergoing simultaneously. If the Emperor's realm fell, the Emperor's person was ultimately unprotected. If the Imperium Nihilus became a zone from which chaos could recruit and build toward a final assault without any Imperial interference, then Terra was eventually going to face something no force on it could turn back. The Custodians' long logic, applied to the changed circumstances of the era Indomitus, demanded active deployment rather than passive vigil, and so the 10,000 are at war again, in ways that would have been unthinkable in the 40th millennium. They participate in crusades, they hunt specific targets across star systems, and they serve as the highest authority diplomatic representatives of the imperial will in situations where no other form of representation carries sufficient weight. The Dankanatwai, a new custodian organization created in the wake of Guilliman's return, are dedicated specifically to hunting down and executing the traitors who fled Terra during the Horus Heresy and have been evading justice for 10,000 years. Imagine having the patience and the institutional memory to maintain a 10,000-year manhunt. That is the Adeptus Custodes. They carry their guilt into this new era alongside their golden arms. Some of them, like Col Quan, who serves as an unwilling companion to Guilliman through parts of the Indomitus Crusade, express the complicated feelings of an organization that is newly active in a galaxy that has declined in part because of their long inaction. The anger, the shame, the weight of 10,000 years of watching from behind the walls while the Emperor's dream was systematically disassembled by time and corruption and political failure. These things do not disappear, because the Custodians are finally free to act. If anything, the freedom makes the weight of past restraint more vivid rather than less. Part 11, What They Are and What They Mean. There is one final thing about the Adeptus Custodes that deserves extended reflection, and it is something that goes beyond the tactical analyses and the organizational charts and the specific sequence of historical events that we have been tracing across this entire exploration. It is the question of what they represent philosophically and why their story resonates the way it does, even in a setting full of extraordinary factions and compelling characters. The Custodians are, when you really sit with all of what they are and all of what they have endured, possibly the most internally consistent and the most genuinely tragic faction in all of Warhammer 40,000. Not tragic because they are weak, they are the opposite of weak. Not tragic because they made poor choices. Their choices have been internally logical throughout. They are tragic for the reason that the greatest tragedies always are, because they gave everything possible, held nothing back, lived entirely for their purpose, and still found that it was not enough to prevent the unthinkable from happening. And every other major Imperial faction exists in a state of compromise with reality. The Space Marines have become creatures of their chapters and their particular gene lineages in ways that have fragmented the Emperor's original vision. The Ecclesiarchy has built a religion around an emperor who specifically and explicitly rejected worship as an organizing principle for human civilization. The Inquisition operates in such extreme moral complexity that the line between the heresy it fights and the methods it uses to fight that heresy has long since become impossible to locate with precision. The High Lords of Terra have, for most of their history, governed in ways that would make the Emperor genuinely weep. The Custodians have not compromised in this way, and that is simultaneously their greatest strength and the source of their most profound pain. They have maintained absolute fidelity to a single purpose, the protection of a single being, across 10,000 years of temptation, loss, institutional pressure, and civilizational decline that would have tested any lesser organization to its breaking point. And they have done this not because they are mindlessly programmed, not because they lack the intelligence to question their mission, but because they made the conscious choice, individually and collectively, day after day across those 10,000 years, to hold the line that had been entrusted to them. And yet it was not enough. The Emperor fell while they watched. Everything that followed, the Golden Throne, the daily sacrifice, the decay of everything he built, the endless war, all of it flows from a single moment when they were found wanting. They know this. They will always know this. No amount of subsequent excellence, no number of battles won, or enemies destroyed, or crises averted, will ever fully balance that specific entry in their ledger. This is what gives the Adeptus Custodes their particular resonance within the 40,000 setting. They are the universe's clearest statement of a truth that the setting returns to again and again in different forms. That excellence is not enough. That dedication is not enough. That doing everything right in your own terms and your own framework can still lead to the outcome you were trying to prevent, because the universe is indifferent to how hard you tried. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is defined by that indifference. It is expressed in 10,000 different ways across 1,000,000 different worlds. And the Custodians, in their golden armor, carrying their ancient guilt, standing vigil over a broken emperor on a failing throne, are perhaps the purest expression of what that indifference looks like when it touches the very best that the human species can produce. They fight on. They will always fight on. In the era Indomitus, no longer confined to a single palace on a single world, they carry that weight into the stars, into engagements across the galaxy, into confrontations with enemies that have not feared golden warriors for 10,000 years and are now being reminded of what that fear felt like. For the Emperor on the Golden Throne, his light still burning. For the humanity he dedicated his extraordinary existence to protecting. For the dream, however battered and distorted it has become across 10,000 years of corruption and war, that somewhere, somehow, something better is still possible. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but standing at the very heart of it, unyielding in their auramite gold, armed with weapons that are legends, shaped by a process that turns children into something approaching the divine, carrying 10,000 years of guilt and devotion in equal measure, are the 10,000. And they are not going anywhere. Closing thoughts. The Adeptus Custodes are, when you step back and consider them from a distance, one of the most remarkable things in the entire Warhammer 40,000 universe. Individually, they are the most capable warriors ever created. Collectively, they represent an unbroken thread of devotion, stretching across more time than most human civilizations have existed. They are the last people who remember what the Emperor's dream actually looked like from the inside, before the compromises and the decay and the slow transformation of a rational political project into a religious institution built on fear and ignorance. And they carry mysteries that have not yet been resolved. Constantine Valdor, the first and greatest of them, somewhere in the galaxy still, 10,000 years gone and still moving, still pursuing some purpose that neither the Imperium nor Chaos nor the Eldar have been able to identify or stop. The question of whether the Emperor can ever be healed, and what the Custodians would do with themselves if that healing came. It's the long-term trajectory of an organization that has spent 10 millennia in mourning and is now being asked to go to war again, carrying all of that history as additional weight on already extraordinary shoulders. These stories are still being written, and they will be extraordinary. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, exploring the deep lore of the 10,000. If you found this journey through the history and philosophy of the Adeptus Custodes as fascinating as I found putting it together, Please consider leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of detailed, careful lore content, and that matters to me enormously. If you are not yet part of this community here on Finn the Emperor, please consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes this deep, always in the same spirit, calm, is careful, thorough, and genuinely in love with the universe that Games Workshop has built across all these extraordinary years. There are a million more stories in the Imperium of Man waiting to be explored. The Custodians are just one of them, extraordinary as they are. The Emperor protects, and the 10,000 protect the Emperor. Until next time, approximate runtime at standard narration pace, 2 hours, 10 to 15 minutes, extended section, the physical reality of what they are. Let us slow down and take a more unhurried look at what a Custodian actually is in physical terms, because even among fans who know 40k well, the specific degree to which Custodians differ from Space Marines is sometimes underestimated. A standard Space Marine stands approximately 7 feet tall. He masses somewhere in the vicinity of 300 to 350 kilograms in full armor. His enhanced physiology gives him, depending on the specific iteration of gene seed and the chapter in question, somewhere between 22 and 25 distinct biological augmentations beyond the baseline human body. Secondary hearts, reinforced bone structure, capable of absorbing impacts that would shatter unaugmented bone, a filter lung that can process most toxins without harm, the ability to partially digest psychoactive chemicals harmlessly, and so on through a list that covers almost every conceivable physiological edge case a warrior might encounter in the 41st millennium. A Custodian stands close to 9 feet tall even out of armor. The weight differential, combined with the nature of their augmentation, it means they mass in the range of 400 to 500 kilograms in their full Custodian plate, but the raw numbers do not capture the qualitative difference in what they actually are. A Space Marine is, at the most fundamental level, still a human being who has been modified. His basic architecture remains human. His skeleton has been reinforced, but it is still a skeleton organized along fundamentally human lines. His organs are augmented versions of human organs. The gene seed has built on the existing human template and improved it substantially, but the template remains. A Custodian's creation involved going much deeper than that. The alchemical augmentation processes used on Custodians do not simply add to the existing human template. They restructure it at a level so fundamental that calling the result a modified human being is almost a category error. The bones are denser, yes, and the musculature more powerful, yes, but those are the surface expressions of changes that extend to the cellular and potentially subcellular level. The psychological conditioning alone, described in the sources as shaping the psyche, with the precision of a master gemsmith cutting a perfect stone, implies a depth of mental modification that has no real equivalent in the Space Marine creation process. A Custodian does not just think faster than a Space Marine or access more information more efficiently. They think in genuinely different ways. The underlying structure of their cognition, shaped by decades of mimetic training and psychological conditioning that begins in infancy and never truly ends. The result, in practice, is warriors who can do things that Space Marines cannot match. One Custodian, in multiple recorded instances across the lore, has held off multiple Space Marines simultaneously and won. 6 Custodians holding back a Tyranid hive fleet's ground forces without casualties is one of those details that gets cited frequently in discussions of their capability, and it is genuinely astonishing when you think about what a Tyranid assault at that scale means. Coordinated attacks by thousands of organisms designed for nothing except killing, controlled by a hive mind of incomprehensible strategic capability, thrown against 6 warriors, and those 6 warriors held. Because they were built to hold against whatever came, and whatever came that day was not equal to what they were. The comparison to Primarchs that appears repeatedly in the lore is not casual exaggeration. It is reflecting a real observation about the tier of capability these warriors occupy. A Primarch is approximately 1 level above a Custodian in terms of raw capability, give or take the massive variation between individual Primarchs. The most warlike and combat-focused Primarchs, the ones built specifically to excel in direct physical confrontation, would likely defeat a Custodian in direct single combat on most occasions. The more tactically or politically oriented Primarchs might find the margin much thinner than their pride would prefer, and a veteran custodian shield captain. Yes, someone who has been fighting and training and refining their capabilities for centuries, is operating in a range where the gap between themselves and a Primarch becomes genuinely debatable in specific scenarios. This tier of capability is why 10,000 of them was ever considered sufficient to guard an empire. It is not that 10,000 is a lot of warriors in absolute terms. It is that 10,000 warriors of this specific caliber represents a force that no conventional military can meaningfully challenge on the battlefield. The mathematics of casualty ratios at this level of capability make conventional numbers increasingly irrelevant. A force that requires thousands of ordinary soldiers to neutralize one of its members is effectively immune to attrition in the way conventional armies understand that term. Vapid Extended Section, the Emperor's relationship with the Custodians. To truly understand the Custodians, you also need to understand something about the relationship between them and the Emperor himself, because that relationship is unlike any other in the Imperium, and it shapes everything about who and what they are. The Emperor was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most extraordinary beings the human species has ever produced. An ancient being, impossibly old, who had lived through the entirety of human history from the earliest civilizations through the Horus Heresy, accumulating knowledge and experience and capability across millennia. His intellect was genuinely beyond ordinary human measurement. His understanding of biology, genetics, psychology, history, philosophy, and 100 other disciplines ran so deep that even the most brilliant unmodified human minds of the 30th and 31st millennia could barely comprehend a fraction of what he knew, and he was lonely. That is not a sentiment you find explicitly in a lot of the primary 40k sources, because the Imperium does not really do explicit emotional analysis of the Emperor, but it is implicit in 1,000 details when you look for them. The Emperor built the Primarchs as sons, as beings who could engage with him on a level that ordinary human advisors simply could not. He built the Custodians as companions, as warriors who could stand with him and speak with him and understand him in ways that his Space Marine armies, brilliant and loyal as many of them were simply not capable of doing. The Heteron Guard, the innermost circle of the Custodians who formed the Emperor's personal escort and never left his side, were described as frequently serving as his aides and confidants, not just his shields, his companions. This tells you something important about what the Custodians were built to be that purely tactical analysis misses. They were created not just to fight for the Emperor, but to be with him, to occupy the same conversational and intellectual space, to be present in a way that mattered to someone who had been alive long enough to find ordinary human relationships feel ephemeral, who had watched thousands of generations live and die, and could perhaps not quite allow himself to invest fully in relationships that would be over in what felt, to him, like moments. The Custodians, with their centuries-long lifespans, were different. Yes, they were there for enough of his story to matter in a way that ordinary humans simply could not be. Constantine Valdor, who served from the Unification Wars through the Horus Heresy, was genuinely one of the very small number of beings in the universe who knew the Emperors across a span of time long enough to have a real understanding of him. Not just the icon, the symbol, the Emperor as God that the Imperium would eventually construct. The actual person, the man who had doubts and made decisions he second-guessed, and carried the weight of knowing things he could not fully share with anyone who lacked the context to understand them. That relationship of genuine mutual regard between beings who could actually understand each other to some degree is part of what makes the Custodians' guilt so profound and so permanent. Yet that they did not fail a god or a symbol. They failed someone they knew, someone who had invested in them not just as instruments of his will, but as the closest things he had to genuine companions across the long arc of his existence. When you read the lore through that lens, the mourning black they wore after the heresy takes on additional weight. The 10,000 years of vigil over a figure who could no longer speak to them, who could no longer acknowledge their presence, who existed now only as a burning psychic light and a slowly failing body in a golden machine, becomes something that is not just duty, it is grief. The longest, quietest, most sustained expression of grief in the history of the species. And maintained by warriors who were built to feel everything more deeply than ordinary humans do, and who have been denied the ordinary human outlets for that feeling across an entire geological epoch of mourning. Extended section: the Custodians and the Space Marines. A complicated relationship. The relationship between the Adeptus Custodes and the Space Marines is one of the more nuanced and more interesting dynamics in all of 40,000, and it is worth spending time with it properly. On the surface, it might seem simple. The Custodians are the Emperor's personal guard, created before the Space Marines existed, more powerful by nearly every individual metric, answerable to nobody except the Emperor himself. The Space Marines are the mass-produced inheritors of a different vision, built to conquer a galaxy rather than guard a single man. And one organization is a collection of individual masterworks. The other is an industrial program scaled to produce millions of warriors from standardized templates. But the reality is more textured than that, and the sources that explore the interactions between these two organizations tend to reveal something genuinely complex going on beneath the surface of mutual acknowledgement. The Custodians, at their best, understand what the Space Marines are. They understand that the legions, and later the chapters, represent a different kind of excellence, one that is about collective capability rather than individual supremacy. A Space Marine Legion in full operation, with its logistical support and its combined arms approach and its ability to sustain a campaign across multiple fronts simultaneously, you can accomplish things that 10,000 Custodians simply cannot do. Not because the Custodians are less capable individually, but because they are not designed to operate as a mass military force. They are designed to be irreplaceable individual warriors, and that design choice, while producing the most capable fighters in the Imperium, also makes them structurally unsuitable for the kind of grinding, sustained, logistically complex military campaigning that the Great Crusade and the endless wars of the 41st Millennium actually require. The Space Marines, for their part, have historically carried a mixture of profound respect and complicated feelings toward the Custodians that is visible throughout the lore. The respect is genuine. The Custodians are obviously superior in individual combat, obviously better equipped, and obviously operating at a higher tier of capability. Denying that would be intellectually dishonest, and the traditions of the Adeptus Astartes generally do not encourage that kind of dishonesty with oneself. The complicated feelings come from other places. One source of friction is the Custodians' tendency to treat Space Marines with a certain cool detachment that can read as condescension. The Custodians do not operate by the same codes of brotherhood that are central to Space Marine culture. They do not share the same bonds of genetic kinship, the same traditions of battle honor and chapter loyalty that make Space Marine organizations function as cohesive units with genuine emotional investment in each other. To a Custodian, a Space Marine is a capable warrior serving an important function, as the specific individuals within that category are worthy of professional respect. But the deep personal bonds that Space Marines form with their brothers, which Space Marine culture treats as one of the most important things about being an Astartes, register to Custodians as something that is relevant to others, but not particularly to them. There is also the question of the Custodians' absolute authority to stand in judgment over Space Marines in specific contexts. When a Custodian exercises that authority, it is not merely a formal power differential. It is a reminder, built into the very structure of the encounter, that the Space Marines are servants of the Imperium, while the Custodians are servants of the Emperor personally, and those are not the same thing. The distinction has practical implications. The Custodians have, what in the current era, been known to intercede in situations involving Space Marines in ways that the chapters in question found uncomfortable or outright offensive. The authority to do so was not questioned, but it was also not warmly received. The return of Guilliman has complicated this dynamic further in interesting ways. Guilliman's obvious affection for his own Space Marines, his deep personal investment in the Astartes tradition and the chapter system he had largely created after the heresy, puts him in an interesting position relative to the Custodians. He respects the Custodians. He needs them. He works with Valoris in ways that appear, in the sources, to involve genuine mutual regard. But he also has views about the institutional failures of the long millennium of Vigil. And some of those views touch on the Custodians' role in those failures. And that tension does not simply resolve because both parties have the same broad goals. The Emissaries Imperatus shield host serves as an interesting case study in how the Custodians and Space Marines can find a productive mode of interaction. When the Torchbearer fleets were sent out during the Indomitus Crusade to deliver Primaris technology to isolated Space Marine chapters, the Custodian squads attached to those fleets were described as serving as heralds of the Golden Throne, their presence guaranteeing the legitimacy of the mission in situations where that legitimacy might otherwise be questioned. Chapters that were suspicious of Guilliman's motives, or skeptical about the Primaris warriors being integrated into their ranks, has found those suspicions difficult to maintain when the gift was being delivered by the Emperor's own Custodians. It was a deeply practical application of the weight that the Custodian identity carries in the Imperium's culture. And in those moments, the complicated feelings between the two traditions were set aside in service of a shared purpose. Extended section, the question of faith and the ecclesiastical problem. One of the more fascinating tensions in the lore surrounding the Custodians concerns their relationship with the ecclesiarchy and the broader religious transformation of the Imperium. The Emperor explicitly rejected the concept of being worshipped. This is not speculative reading between the lines. The sources are direct. The Emperor considered the rise of superstition, religion, and irrational faith to be among the most serious dangers facing humanity in its long-term development. He saw the warp-feeding properties of concentrated human belief, the way that psychic resonance created by mass worship could strengthen demonic entities in the immaterium, as a compelling practical argument against any form of organized religion focused on a powerful figure. And he saw the social and intellectual damage done by cultures built around faith rather than reason as a civilizational vulnerability that his Imperium was meant to move beyond. Then he was placed on the Golden Throne, and gradually, over the following centuries, he was transformed in the collective consciousness of the Imperium into a god. The God Emperor, the divine light, the savior of humanity. A religion built around his worship became the dominant cultural institution in the Imperium, enforced by law, maintained by an organization with its own armies and its own political power, and its own interpretation of what the Emperor wanted, which was sometimes accurate and sometimes extraordinarily self-serving. The Custodians have complicated feelings about this. On one hand, they understand pragmatically that the ecclesiarchy and the faith it maintains serve real functions in the Imperium. The absolute certainty that faith can provide is genuinely valuable in a universe full of things that can shake certainty to its foundations. The Sisters of Battle, who have been among the Custodians' most consistent and capable allies through various crises, draw their extraordinary resilience and willpower directly from that faith. Yet the morale value of religious conviction across 1 trillion ordinary humans facing the perpetual horrors of the 41st millennium is not something that can simply be dismissed in favor of pure rationalism. On the other hand, the Custodians remember the Emperor as he actually was, not as the religion has constructed him. They remember a being who was rational, who planned, who made calculated decisions, who had specific views about how human civilization should be organized, and specific reasons for those views. The religion built around his memory has preserved some of that, but it has also accumulated enormous amounts of interpretation, tradition, and institutional interests that bear increasingly little relationship to what the Emperor actually believed or wanted. The Custodians cannot correct this publicly, because doing so would destabilize institutions that are currently holding the Imperium together by main force of collective belief. But they are not required to pretend that the current state of things is what their master intended. This tension is one of the more subtle and more interesting aspects of the Custodians' position in the modern 40,000 setting. They are simultaneously the most authentic remaining connection to the Emperor's actual intentions, and the organization with the least institutional leverage to actually act on that authenticity. Their authority in specific contexts is absolute, but their ability to reshape the broader culture of the Imperium, to undo 10,000 years of drift from the Emperor's original vision, this is essentially non-existent without the kind of galactic-scale intervention that only a returned Primarch like Guilliman can even attempt. The fact that Guilliman, on his return, was horrified by the state of the Imperium and has spent his time since then trying to reform it, resonated with the Custodians in ways that the sources make visible. Valoris understood what Guilliman's return meant, not just strategically but philosophically. There was now someone with enough authority to actually push back against the institutional drift, to attempt to steer the Imperium towards something closer to what the Emperor had originally envisioned. Whether that attempt can succeed against 10,000 years of accumulated inertia and self-interested institutional resistance remains deeply uncertain. But the Custodians, who have been holding faith with a vision they have been unable to defend publicly for 10 millennia, found in Guilliman's return something they had largely given up expecting, a reason to think the effort might still be worth making. Extended section, the Shadow Keepers, and what they guard. Among all the specialized organizations within the Adeptus Custodes, the Shadow Keepers occupy a particularly compelling position in the lore. Their black armor sets them apart visually from their golden brothers. Their mission sets them apart in ways that go considerably deeper than color. The Imperial Palace is one of the largest structures ever built by human hands. Its footprint covers a significant portion of what was once the continent of Eurasia. Its uppermost towers reach into the upper atmosphere, and extending downward from its occupied levels, going deeper into the bedrock of the planet than any other structure, are the dungeons and vaults of the Imperial Palace, a labyrinthine network of sealed chambers and secured corridors that goes down for kilometers into the ancient rock of Terra itself. What is in those vaults? The Custodians, and specifically the Shadow Keepers, know. Most of it is not documented anywhere accessible to outside parties, and what documentation exists is maintained at classification levels that effectively mean it exists only for the Custodians themselves. But what the sources do reveal, in fragments and implications across various Black Library works, suggests a collection of things that the Imperium has encountered in its long history and decided cannot be destroyed, cannot be allowed to exist freely, and therefore must simply be contained in perpetuity. Yet demons of unusual antiquity and power, bound into physical containers or trapped within warding matrices that require constant maintenance to remain effective. Xenos artifacts whose effects cannot be predicted, and whose destruction would potentially be more dangerous than their continued secure storage. The experiments and products of Imperial research programs that were deemed too successful, too dangerous, too fundamentally destabilizing to the assumptions underlying Imperial theology and governance to be allowed to become common knowledge. Ancient weapons whose use would carry consequences that the Imperium has collectively decided it cannot afford to pay, and maintaining the containment of all of this, checking the wards, sustaining the bindings, patrolling the corridors where no other light but their own ever reaches. It are the Shadow Keepers. They are described in the sources as warriors who must possess superhuman resolve and a fortitude of will so unbreakable that it is like unto a monolithic fortress. The reason for that requirement becomes clear when you think about what they guard. Things that have been carefully selected over millennia for their ability to corrupt, destabilize, and destroy. The job of being in the constant presence of those things, day after day, decade after decade, requires a specific kind of psychological architecture that even ordinary custodians might not entirely possess. The Shadow Keepers wear black because their duty is performed in darkness, and the color is honest about that. They are not the golden radiance of the custodians who walk in public ceremonies or accompany the Emperor's emissaries across the galaxy. They are the silent ones who make all of that possible by ensuring that the darkness below the palace stays contained and does not reach upward to contaminate everything above it. In the era Indomitus, with the broader custodian force deploying across the galaxy, the Shadow Keeper's mission has become more complex rather than simpler. The vaults have not become less dangerous simply because the universe has become more chaotic. If anything, the increase in demonic activity across the galaxy since the Great Rift's formation has put additional pressure on containment that was designed for more stable conditions. The Shadow Keepers are not going anywhere. Their vigil is, if possible, even less interruptible than the broader custodian watch over the Golden Throne. This extended section, the Silent Sisterhood, the Custodians' allies. No discussion of the Adeptus Custodes is complete without acknowledging the order that has served alongside them since the earliest days of the Unification Wars. The Sisters of Silence, also known as the Silent Sisterhood, or the Adeptus Astra Telepathica's Null Maidens, or simply the Blanks. They are everything the Custodians are not, in the most complementary possible way. The Custodians are physical perfection given purpose. The Sisters of Silence are something stranger and in some ways more unsettling, women who are born as psychic gnolls, individuals who exist in a state of absolute absence in the warp, around whom psychic energy simply does not work. They cannot be influenced by psychic powers. They cannot be sensed by psychers. Demons find their presence agonizing. And because demons are beings of the warp, and the presence of a gnoll, a blank space in the psychic sea, causes them genuine pain simply by proximity. A single sister of silence standing near a manifested demon is a meaningful tactical asset. A squad of them, advancing together, creates a zone of psychic negation that can shut down sorcerers, destabilize possessions, and make the environments most hostile to conventional soldiers into something approaching a fair fight. Combined with the Custodians, they form what the ancient designation calls the Talons of the Emperor. The Emperor's two hands, one reaching out to crush physical threats, one reaching out to negate psychic ones. The combination was devastatingly effective in the Webway War, where the demonic hordes they faced required exactly this kind of dual threat response. It was effective at the Siege of Terra. It is effective in the current era, where the increased prevalence of demonic incursions and warp-touched threats makes the Sisters' particular capability more relevant than it has been since the Heresy. The Silent Sisterhood itself has a complicated history in the post-Heresy period. After the Horus Heresy, the Order fragmented. The broader Silent Sisterhood had been deployed across the galaxy in various roles, and the chaos of the Heresy and its aftermath scattered them across hundreds of worlds, with communications cut. The central organization on Terra maintained itself as the small force that had fought in the Webway and at the Siege, but the wider Sisterhood became dispersed and in many cases effectively lost. Individual sisters continued their work in various capacities, but the cohesive organization that had made them so effective was gone for 10,000 years. Guilliman's return changed this as well. One of his first formal acts regarding the broader Imperial military was the Dispensatus Anathema, a declaration that sent Custodians and Sisters who had stood with him at the Battle of Luna out across the galaxy to find their dispersed kindred and bring them back together. The reformation of the Silent Sisterhood as a coherent and formally recognized institution, working alongside the newly active Custodians, was one of the more strategically significant consequences of the return of the Primarch. In an era defined by the increased presence of demonic forces and warp-touched threats, having a reliable and growing organization of psychic gnolls available as a complement to the Golden Warriors made the Talons of the Emperor genuinely more formidable than either component would have been alone. The relationship between the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence is interesting in itself. Where the Custodians are profoundly individual, deeply engaged with questions of personal honor and accumulated distinction, the Sisters operate under a vow of silence and communicate through an elaborate sign language that outsiders cannot follow. They are, in a sense, the opposite of the Custodians' philosophical orientation. Where the Custodians are scholars and debaters and accumulators of named honorifics, the Sisters communicate in gestures and presence and the simple fact of what they are. Yes, their relationship with the Custodians is one of the older and more genuine partnerships in Imperial history, built not on institutional necessity, but on a shared purpose that stretches back to the very earliest days of the Emperor's project. Extended section, looking forward. The mysteries yet to be resolved. The 40,000 setting is, among its many distinctive qualities, one that does not rush to tie up its loose threads. The mysteries that have been accumulating across decades of lore continue to develop, and the Adeptus Custodes sit at the center of several of the most compelling unresolved questions in the current narrative. Constantine Valdor remains the largest. Whatever the Black Library fiction is building toward with the King in Yellow, it represents the most significant potential narrative event involving the Custodians since Guilliman's return. The possibility that the first and greatest of the 10,000 has spent 10,000 years building something, accumulating resources and power, and allies towards some purpose that even he has not made fully explicit, is the kind of narrative thread that could redefine the entire faction depending on where it goes. The theories range widely. Valdor working to heal the Emperor, Valdor working to replace the Imperium with something closer to the Emperor's original vision, Valdor working to complete some mission the Emperor gave him before walking out of the palace that night. The specific direction matters enormously for what it says about him and about the Custodians' broader legacy. Yet the question of the Emperor's potential healing or resurrection is another thread that the current narrative is pulling on with increasing visibility. The Golden Throne is explicitly stated to be failing. The mechanisms that keep it operational are partially incomprehensible to the tech priests who maintain it, degraded by 10,000 years of continuous use in ways that even the most skilled artisans cannot fully repair. The Custodians know this. They have known it for centuries. The implications of the throne's eventual total failure and the question of what could potentially replace it or forestall that failure are questions that the 10,000 carry with them every day. The Dankanatoi, the new custodian organization dedicated to hunting the traitors who fled Terra during the heresy, represents another open narrative thread. It's 10,000 years of fugitives, scattered across a galaxy and in some cases certainly dead, but in others potentially still alive through the same mechanisms that keep custodians alive for centuries, or the various warp-based distortions of time that the setting allows for. The hunt is real and ongoing. Who they find and what those encounters reveal about the history of the heresy era remains to be written. And there is the broader question of what the custodians become in the long run of the era Indomitus. They are no longer the passive vigil force of the 40th millennium. They are actively shaping events across the galaxy. That new role requires them to engage with the Imperium in ways they have not done for 10,000 years, to rebuild institutional relationships that have been purely formal for most of recorded history. It's to find a mode of being that maintains the core of their identity, the absolute fidelity to the Emperor's purpose, while operating in a context that demands more flexibility and more engagement with the broader human civilization than their culture has historically encouraged. The custodians who grew up in the long centuries of the Vigil are adapting to this new reality alongside custodians who have been created specifically for the more active era that Valorous has been building toward. The tension between the institutional memory of 10,000 years of restraint and the new imperative of active engagement is visible in the sources, and it will continue to shape the organization's internal culture as the narrative moves forward. These are not small questions. They are the kind of questions that shape entire narrative eras. And the Adeptus Custodes, golden and ancient and carrying the weight of everything they have ever been through, are at the center of all of them.